Welcome into another edition of the 14. I'm Chris Lee. He's Blake Lovell. Blake, today we're going to talk about the Missouri Tigers in our series of SEC basketball previews for the 2021-22 season. And boy, Blake, you look at this roster, there's just not a lot of names you're going to recognize. The Tigers bring back Kobe Brown, who started all 25 games a year ago, Javon Pickett, who was, I guess, their sixth or seventh man, depending on the day, he or Mitchell Smith. And then a guy named Jordan Wilmore who played 20 minutes and 45 seconds left. And those three are what is left of last year's Missouri team. So certainly a lot of new faces are going to play key roles this year.
Yeah, Missouri was probably one of the most experienced teams in the country last year. They were 11th in Ken Palm in experience, and pretty much started all upperclassmen. They had, I think, five seniors that probably played significant minutes at times, and now you bring back two guys who played, and that's a team that ranked as high as number 10 in the country last year. Of course, they got off to that 13-3 start, but then they really struggled down the stretch, lost 7 of 10 to finish the season. So, it's kind of that double whammy where you really end the season on a bad note, then you lose a lot of those guys, and you only bring two guys back. And yeah, it's certainly going to be a different dynamic for them. You're going to put them, I think, in that category with these teams, like Georgia, like A&M, who have just lost a lot from last season. But I think, yeah, they're our team to play. It's just because they've got guys coming in that are pretty good, but I don't know how that chemistry comes together, and that's where you're essentially having to shoot 100% on all these transfers, because if not, you're not going to have necessarily the depth or that you probably need to compete in that top half of the SEC. And I mean, Kobe Brown, he's an all SEC type player. I think he could. Well, I mean, he has to be if they're gonna win games. He's got to be. I think an all SEC player. He's got to, which he has. Like, he's continued to improve over the past couple seasons he's been there. So I'll give him that. Like, I think he could emerge into an all SEC caliber player. Beyond that, though, it's Javon Pickett started a lot of games, even though he was kind of the sixth man last year. But I just, yeah, they have got a lot to replace, and there's more questions than answers, I think, right now for them.
Well, they're going to have four impact transfers. And let's start with two. They got two interesting ones, Jerron Coleman and Amari Davis. Coleman was the 2019 Horizon League Freshman of the Year. Davis was the 2019 MAC Freshman of the Year, I believe. So you have two guys that were Freshmen of the Year in their leagues, in mid-major leagues 2 years ago. Coleman averaged 13.8 points, 5.2 rebounds, 3.2 assists, and shot the ball pretty well. Davis went 17.1 and 3.2 boards a year ago. Played almost 35 minutes a game, so rarely came off the floor. Uh, what do you make of those two guys? How SEC ready are each of them?
Well, I think they will be the two that you look at and say, all right, these two probably should be okay. I think Davis is just. I mean, he's just someone that he's just a scorer. I mean, he was fantastic at Green Bay, and he was someone that really never came off the floor pretty much for them. And I think that just his ability to score, I think he'll be fine and be able to transition pretty well into that type of role that they need him to have on this team. And then you mentioned with Coleman. I mean, he's also someone that, I mean, he had a really strong finish to the season. He had 33 in that MAC tournament game against Toledo. Of course, Toledo was the top seed in that. I think the final 5 games of the season, he had 24 more points 3 times in that stretch. So it's always just about how does that, transition to the SEC, and how does that scale up into the SEC. We always say that about guys who transfer up, and I think that's just the big question. These are certainly talented guys, and I'd be more surprised than not if they're not able to come in and make a huge impact for this team, because, like I said, with the other guys, like, they have to, out of necessity. There is no other choice. Like, they have to come in and make a huge impact, because otherwise, I just don't think Missouri is going to be able to really have a very good season. So those are the two that are going to lead the way. I would be surprised if not, but they also have a couple other guys too that could possibly factor into that mix as well. But these are the guys from a production standpoint that certainly have, the numbers to kind of set them up to have success. It's just a matter of seeing if that can translate in the SEC.
What do you make of Dejuan Gordon? He's a Chicago kid. He'll be a junior. He played at Kansas State a year ago, which is in a down cycle. 9.4 points, 5.5 boards. So he's a guard who rebounds a lot. Where does he fit in? I mean, I would presume you look at them and you have to feel like they'll probably go three guards with those two mid-major kids, and Gordon probably is their starters. But where do you think Gordon fits in with them this year?
Well, I mean, the rebounding part, I think, is he's got. I mean, he'll have to score and stuff, like you said too. But I think, this guy had four double doubles as a 6'3" guard. That's pretty good when you look at it that way. And he led, he was Kansas State's leading rebounder. So that's going to be important because we've got to remember, like, this is a team losing Jeremiah Tillman and Drew Smith and like all Mitchell Smith and guys like that. Like, there's a lot to replace on that standpoint. It's not just going to be, I think, one guy that's going to be able to do that in a lot of these scenarios. Of course, Kobe Brown will be able to make up for a lot of the rebounding and that type of stuff, I think, on the interior. But having a guard like Gordon who can, not just be someone that'll score, but I think actually he's very important because he is someone where I think there are other guys who can take off the scoring load, but if he can be someone that can add a lot of help on the rebounding part of things, that's going to go a long way too, because there's so much I think that they have to figure out in a lot of different areas that I think Gordon could be a pretty valuable asset in that particular one. And look, he did play for Kansas State. They were bad, but he played 26 minutes a game and started 22 games in the Big 12, and I think that goes a long way too. Like, I think you perhaps feel like there's a less of adjustment needed for him because he's already played in the Power Conference, and he not just played, but he played a lot of minutes against some of the best teams in the country. So I think he should be able to transition pretty nicely and fit in pretty well, I think, in the rotation.
Well, and then you have Ronnie DeGray from UMass, and he had an interesting year because early in the year he was barely coming off the floor. He had a 21-point game as a freshman, and down the stretch he was about a half timer. He comes in last year's numbers at UMass. You're looking at 8.7 points, 4.6 points a game. Overall, 27.4 minutes a game. Again, the minutes was a little tilted more towards the first half of the season, but another one that I think gives him certainly a rotation piece at worst.
Yeah, I mean, a combo type forward. I think, that's where you talk about versatility and that sort of stuff. I feel like on this team in particular, this season, they need guys like that who are very versatile and can kind of do different things. And I feel like he's another one that kind of fits that mold, probably a little bit like Gordon in that sense, that he'll be able to help them out, you would think, in a couple different areas. And he does have some size, it's 6'6", 225. I think that he will be able to really help them too. I think defensively, I think that's something that he can probably help them in that area too, because that's been sort of the staple of Konzo's teams over the years, is that it's been a team that will grind you out and really has to play very good defense because they haven't always been the most efficient on offense. So I feel like these are guys that are going to fit that mold. But again, this is like all four of these guys we've talked about. Like, all four of them have to come in right away and be key contributors. I just think that there's really not a lot of other options if they're not. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see, can all four of these guys do that? Was one of these guys maybe not? And then what kind of pressure does that put on the freshmen that they're going to bring in? That's the biggest question, I think.
Well, the other thing, and the criticism of Konzo Martin has been the recruiting, right? And he's brought in one spectacular recruit in terms of guys that really got headlines, and the guy played about 5 minutes. We all remember that one pretty well. But you look at their class this year, they bring in four true freshmen. None of them cracked the Rivals top 150. Any of these kids make an impact? Because it seems to me that they've got about six guys who have proven something between the four transfers and the two returnees we talked about. I don't know what they get out of Jordan Wilmore, but in any case, somebody else has got to make an impact. Who else on the roster do you see is the guy that could crack the rotation, or maybe a couple of guys who will crack the rotation? Because you're generally going to need at least eight.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, like you said, you get into the freshmen and you assume there's going to be someone that comes out of that group, or hopefully in their case, I think a couple you would hope that comes out of that group and is able to play 20 plus minutes a game. I guess Anton Brookshire. I assume he's the one that's rated the highest, and he will probably. I mean, he's a top 100 player, and he's a scorer. I think that's the biggest thing. He can really shoot, and that's something they're going to need. Is they've got to be able to shoot the ball well too, and that is something that they certainly have struggled with at times. We talk about the offense, like that was sort of one of the things. They didn't necessarily need to have that last year, but they weren't a great 3-point shooting team. And if he can come in and give them a perimeter threat, that opens up more possibilities, I think, for you on offense, because this is a team that I'm more curious, I think, about their offensive identity and what that's going to look like, because I do think they're going to have a solid defensive team. We just know that's what you get with Konzo, and he'll find a way to make a play defense. But I just am curious, how are all the pieces going to come together on offense? And that's where I think, like a Brookshire, I assume, will have his opportunities, because he does look like probably, the guy with the most potential of this freshman group. But if not, who are your 7 or 8? And, I think it goes back to like a guy like Jordan Wilmer, who you said, Wilmore, I mean, he only played, 20 minutes last year, and still, he's a 7'3", 310-pound forward. There are not a lot of those walking around in the SEC. So can you, bring him up to where he almost feels like a newcomer? Can he be someone that can step in and just give them 15 to 20 minutes a game? That, I think, would go a long way, too, towards really helping them fill that void, that's left by Tillman, which, again, they'll have Kobe Brown to do that. But they've got to get the most out of everyone on this roster. I think that's what it comes down to, because I don't think they have a lot of room for error this season, whereas last season they had a lot of depth and they had a lot of experience. And if you had a guy that was a little up and down sometimes, there was enough around them to be able to make up for it. I don't know that that'll be the same scenario with this team, because I think it's where, if a couple of these guys have a bad game, I mean, let's say a Kobe Brown comes out and doesn't have a great game, or, Javon Pickett isn't playing his best, I don't know that they have enough to win these games. And that's where I think it's going to come down to is, I almost think it's like you have to have all these guys. Like, it's not a matter of who's going to step up. It's like, can everyone step up? Because I think they have to have pretty much, the bulk of this 8-man, 9-man, whatever it's going to look like rotation. Like, you're going to have these guys on, I think, night in, night out, because it's going to be tough, I think, for this team, just because I don't know that. I think it's just because we don't know what the identity is going to be yet. And I think once we see that early on in non-conference play, we'll have a better idea of kind of, where some of the gaps could be filled in. But right now, I think they're very hard to place.
It just occurred to me that I saw Jordan Wilmore play in high school. I think he's the anti-Connor Vanover.
Yeah, he's not a step out and shoot the 3 type guy.
No, and he's not a slightly built guy either, as you mentioned. So yeah, he's a huge bodied kid. I don't know where that's going to go, but I remember watching that guy play and thinking that's an intriguing player. And sometimes with big men, you know how this goes. They take a step up, and sometimes it comes quickly. Usually it takes a few years, and I have a feeling in this case it might, but that's an interesting one. Blake, as we wrap up Missouri, the polls and things and the rankings are starting to trickle out a little bit. Right now, it looks like the SEC's got a top tier of about 8 teams that are NCAA tournament worthy, according to what I'm seeing most places. Then you've got Georgia and Texas A&M at the back, maybe. It seems like I'm maybe missing a school or two. And then you got maybe Ole Miss, Mississippi State, maybe that next tier down out of that top 8. Then you got probably Vanderbilt, Missouri. You can make an argument that Vanderbilt might sneak in that next group of NIT-type teams. We've talked about the Commodores before, but I think Missouri, to me, slots as maybe not one of the worst couple teams in the SEC, but hard to see making the NCAAs this year.
Yeah, they're not on paper, they're not a top half team. I don't think they're an NCAA tournament team. Again, unless everything does come together the way that it could if all of these guys are able to contribute. And you have a couple of those guys emerge into all SEC type players, but I think it's just such a huge drop off from what they had last season. And the benefit I think is they will at least have a full off season, whereas last year, as we said, last year was a great year to have a lot of experience because you had guys who had played together and already had chemistry built in. This year, at least they have a full off season to try to build that chemistry. But I think it will probably take a little while to do that. And so my guess is they're probably a team that finishes in that 9 to 12 range. I think it's probably on the higher side of that. But I think that's probably about right to me. I don't really see a lot of, I just don't see them. And it's not necessarily maybe that Missouri is going to be terrible. I think it's just the other teams in the SEC. I think this could be a really, really good season in terms of the top half could be as strong as it's been in a while. So I think that's where the issues come in is maybe Missouri doesn't take maybe it's not a huge drop off from where it was last season, but because I think the SEC is going to be really good at the top, that could kind of push you down a little bit, and maybe you wind up, like I said, in that 9 to 12 type range.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, Blake. To me, they're one of those teams that as we go into the last week of conference play, Missouri probably still doesn't know if it's playing that first SEC tournament game or whether it's not. I think they're right on that edge.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right, Blake, any more thoughts on the Missouri Tigers before we end things today?
No, it will be interesting, like we said, to see kind of where they go from here and who steps up and emerges as their rotation. It's a wild one. Like we're gonna have a hard time figuring out the rotation for Georgia and South Carolina and A&M and teams like that. But yeah, you throw Missouri right in there. What does their rotation look like? How are the minutes distributed and all that? A lot to figure out there.
All right, he's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for listening to another one in our series of SEC basketball preseason previews. We'll be back with more soon.